Chapter 1. The End of Bipolarity.
Okay, so you're here because, like a lot of people, you're fascinated by the end of the Soviet Union, right? This massive empire. Just gone practically overnight.
Yeah, it's one of those huge turning points in history that still has people debating what really caused it.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to do today, dive deep into some of the best historical analyses out there to try to really understand it. What did the end of the Soviet Union actually mean? What led to its collapse and what happened afterwards? We often call it the Second World,
Right.
to distinguish it from the U.S. and Western Europe. So we're going to unpack all of that. And maybe a good place to start to kind of set the scene is with that iconic image of the Berlin Wall coming down.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, just picturing that moment, right? November 1989, this wall that had divided Berlin for almost 3 decades, 150 kilometers long. Just imagine that. And as one of the books you shared points out, that wasn't just about Germany reuniting.
Right.
It was the beginning of the end for the whole communist bloc in Eastern Europe.
Wow, so let's back up a bit then. For people who maybe don't remember all the details, what exactly was this Soviet system that we're talking about?
Well, it all started with the Russian Revolution in 1917. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, overthrowing the Tsar. And they were inspired by this idea of socialism, basically getting rid of private property and creating a truly egalitarian society, a complete rejection of capitalism.
So the opposite of the Western system.
Exactly. And to achieve that, they created a super centralized system where the state and the Communist Party had all the power. No real opposition allowed. And they controlled everything, the economy, every aspect of life. It was planned from the top down.
And after World War II, the Soviet model didn't stay confined to Russia, right?
Right. The Soviet Union had this huge influence across Eastern Europe, these countries that the Red Army had liberated from Nazi Germany.
Right.
And so they kind of imposed this Soviet-style system on them. One-party states, planned economies, the whole deal. And this is what we came to call the Second World, or the Socialist Bloc. And of course, they had their own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, to counter NATO.
So looking at all this from the outside, right, I mean, the Soviet Union really seemed like a major world power. After World War II, they had the second largest economy in the world. They were making progress in things like communication technology. They had vast energy resources. They even had a domestic consumer industry going on.
Yeah, and you can't forget about the social safety net they provided for their citizens. They guaranteed basic living standards, subsidized healthcare, education, childcare. All of that was part of the system. And pretty much everything was owned by the state.
So it sounds like things were going pretty well on the surface, at least. But as your research highlights, there were some serious cracks starting to appear beneath the surface.
Oh, absolutely. Like any system, it had its flaws and they were becoming impossible to ignore. Over time, this Soviet system had become incredibly bureaucratic and authoritarian.
Right.
No real democracy, free speech was suppressed. People could only express dissent through jokes and whispers. And the Communist Party, they had this tight grip on power with no accountability. And even though it was supposed to be this union of 15 republics, in reality, Russia dominated everything. So the needs of other regions and ethnic groups were often ignored.
And then there's the economic side of things. As we learned from these sources, the economy wasn't doing so well either, despite some outward appearances.
Right.
The arms race with the West was putting a huge strain on their resources. They were falling behind, technologically struggling to keep up in key areas.
And people's expectations were rising. They wanted more. But the system couldn't deliver. And then you had things like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which further drained their resources and exposed their weaknesses.
Right.
It was clear by the late 1970s that the Soviet economy was in real trouble. Productivity was declining. There were shortages of basic consumer goods, and they had to start importing more and more food from abroad.
So all this was happening when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. And as you've described in your analysis, he seemed determined to shake things up. He introduces these reforms, perestroika and glasnost, which, aim to restructure the economy, introduce some market elements, allow for greater openness and transparency, basically trying to modernize the Soviet Union and catch up with the West. But as we know, those reforms didn't exactly go as planned.
Yeah, Gorbachev's reforms, they were a game changer, but maybe not in the way he intended. You see these reforms, they created a space for people to speak up, to express their dissatisfaction. And that led to protests erupting across Eastern Europe, people demanding more freedom and democracy. And this time, unlike before, Gorbachev decided not to send in the tanks.
Right.
So these communist regimes in Eastern Europe, one by one, they started to crumble. The Berlin Wall came down. It was a domino effect.
So it was a period of incredible upheaval, and within the Soviet Union itself, things were getting pretty tense too, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Gorbachev was trying to reform the system, but he faced fierce resistance from hardliners within the Communist Party, those who wanted to hold on to power and keep things as they were. And then in 1991, you had this dramatic attempted coup, hardline communists trying to seize control and roll back Gorbachev's reforms.
Right.
It failed, but it further weakened Gorbachev, and it propelled Boris Yeltsin, this charismatic leader of the Russian Republic, onto the national stage.
And it's Yeltsin who becomes kind of the symbol of resistance to the coup.
Exactly.
And in the aftermath of all this, things moved incredibly fast.
They did. Several republics, including Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, they declared their independence. And in December 1991, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved, the Communist Party was banned, and this vast empire that had once seemed so powerful was no more. And almost overnight, these former Soviet republics were thrust into this new world of capitalism and democracy.
So when we look back at all this, right, and we try to make sense of this huge historical event, this collapse of an entire system, what can we say were the key factors that led to the Soviet Union's disintegration?
Well, the sources you've shared point to a whole bunch of interconnected factors, right? Like you were saying earlier, it wasn't just one thing. It was like this perfect storm. But I guess you could say it all boils down to this. The Soviet system ultimately failed to meet the needs and aspirations of its people. Economically and politically, it just couldn't keep up with the changing times.
Right, and the economic stagnation played a huge role, obviously. The burden of maintaining a massive military, supporting all those satellite states trying to compete with the West in the arms race, it all became unsustainable.
And as people became more aware of how much better off people were in the West, that just fueled their dissatisfaction.
Right.
They could see that the Soviet system wasn't delivering the same standard of living, the same freedoms.
And I think what you highlighted earlier about the political stagnation is really important too, right?
Absolutely. The Communist Party had become so entrenched, so unaccountable. There was corruption, inefficiency, a real lack of transparency. People felt alienated from the system. They had no real voice. And the system itself was unable to correct its own mistakes. It was stuck.
And then you had Gorbachev coming in, trying to reform this very rigid system.
Yeah.
And in a way, you could argue that his reforms, although well-intentioned, actually accelerated the process of disintegration.
Yeah, his reforms kind of created this opening, the space for dissent and change. And that unleashed forces that he couldn't control, and ultimately it alienated both the hardliners who opposed any change and those who wanted even more radical reforms.
Right, so everyone was unhappy.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you had the rise of nationalism and the desire for independence in many of the republics. And it's interesting that in many cases, the strongest independence movements came from the more economically advanced republics.
Right.
Like the Baltic states, for example, or Ukraine. They felt like they were carrying the weight of the less developed republics, and they wanted to go their own way.
So the consequences of the Soviet Union's collapse were felt worldwide, right?
Oh, yeah. Massive geopolitical shifts. I mean, first of all, the Cold War was over. This decades-long ideological struggle between communism and capitalism. Capitalism was declared the victor. The U.S. emerged as the sole superpower for a while, and international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF gained more influence as they promoted free market policies across the globe. And of course, liberal democracy became the dominant political model that everyone was supposed to aspire to.
And we saw the birth of all these new independent nations,
Right.
each with their own challenges and opportunities. The Baltic states and many Eastern European countries, they looked to the West. They wanted to join the EU and NATO.
Right.
While the Central Asian republics, they had to navigate this complex geopolitical landscape, trying to balance their relationships with Russia, with the West, with China. It was a whole new world order. And it's important to acknowledge that the transition from communism to capitalism wasn't easy.
It was really rough for a lot of people. This rapid privatization was often called shock therapy. It led to economic hardship for many. Hyperinflation, unemployment, a rise in organized crime.
Right.
And inequality soared in many of these former Soviet republics.
Yeah, and unfortunately, many of these new countries also experienced internal conflicts and tensions. Some even descended into civil war.
And some are still dealing with those issues today.
It's interesting, though, one of the analyses we looked at highlighted how India has managed to maintain good relations with many of these post-Soviet states, particularly Russia.
It's true. It's a relationship built on this foundation of historical trust going back decades. And both countries share this vision of a multipolar world, one where power isn't concentrated in just one country. And they cooperate on a lot of issues, defense, energy, combating terrorism. It's a pretty interesting dynamic.
So I think when we look back at the collapse of the Soviet Union, what's striking is how sudden and unexpected it was. This massive empire that had seemed so permanent just vanished almost overnight. And it makes you wonder what seemingly stable systems or ideologies in the world today might be more vulnerable than we think. What could be the next Soviet Union, so to speak? What seemingly unshakable structures might face a similar fate in the future. It's something to think about.
Yeah, it definitely makes you question assumptions. History has a way of surprising us.
It certainly does. Okay, well, this has been a fascinating look at the end of the Soviet Union. A huge thank you to you for joining me on this deep dive, and thank you to all our listeners for tuning in.
My pleasure. Always a good discussion.
Chapter 2. Contemporary Centers of Power.
Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty big.
Yeah.
New power centers after the Cold War.
Okay.
We're talking European Union, we're talking ASEAN, and of course, China's, economic explosion.
Right.
You've got a ton of material to dig through.
Yeah.
So let's, I guess the goal here is really to understand how they came to be, right?
Yeah.
Where'd they come from, how they grown, and what does their power actually look like on the world stage? Maybe even looking ahead a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
I think it makes sense to start with the EU.
yeah, makes sense to me. That's,
I mean, World War II, it really forced Europe to kind of hit the reset button. Like, what are we going to do here?
yeah.
I mean, the devastation was just unbelievable, the scale of it.
Right.
And they had a choice,
Yeah.
Go back to the old rivalries or try something completely new.
And I guess all that destruction kind of forced them to think differently.
Yeah, that's kind of the irony, right? It was a horrible tragedy,
Right.
but it opened the door for something different.
Yeah, and you can't forget the Cold War in all this.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, the U.S. came in with a Marshall Plan, massive financial aid, and that led to the OEEC, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation.
Right.
Basically, the group figuring out how to use that money.
Yeah, to get back on their feet.
Exactly, and almost by accident, it boosted trade between those countries.
Yeah, that's a good point. It wasn't really the intention, but it happened.
Right.
And then you have the Council of Europe in 49 pushing for more political cooperation. Like, let's actually work together.
So it was this kind of gradual process.
Totally, yeah.
Step by step.
Step by step.
But the European Economic Community, the EEC, that was in 57.
That was huge.
That was a turning point.
It really cemented the economic ties between those initial members.
And then the European Parliament comes along, adding that political layer, right?
Exactly, giving them a voice.
And then, of course, the Soviet bloc falls apart.
Yeah.
That really accelerated things, leading to the European Union in 1992.
And the goal there was even bigger, common policies across the board, even a shared currency.
Which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, how far they've come.
It is, isn't it?
I mean, they've got their own flag, their own anthem, even a founding date.
Yeah.
And they're still working on that common foreign policy.
It's a work in progress.
Yeah.
But economically, I mean, their combined GDP is just massive. They're a global economic powerhouse.
Right. And the euro, I mean, that's a major currency.
Absolutely.
And with all that trade power, I mean, they've got serious leverage on the world stage.
No doubt about it.
But it's interesting how that economic and political power plays out in the global arena.
Yeah. How does it actually translate?
Well, for one, France, as part of the EU, they've got that permanent seat on the UN Security Council.
Right.
That gives them some serious influence there.
For sure. And we've seen them use that leverage, along with their economic clout, to try and sway U.S. policy sometimes, like with the Iran nuclear deal.
Interesting.
Yeah, and militarily, you can't ignore their combined forces. I mean, they're pretty sizable.
Yeah.
Their defense spending is second only to the U.S. globally.
Wow.
And then you've got France with their nuclear arsenal. So that adds another dimension.
Right. So it's not all, sunshine and roses,
Oh,
right?
there's not.
There's some cracks in the facade.
Absolutely. I mean, expanding the membership, that's been a challenge.
Yeah.
Some countries are hesitant to give up that much national control.
Right. And there have been times when their foreign policy hasn't exactly been unified.
Yeah, the Iraq War, that really exposed those differences.
Yeah.
And then you've got what they call Euroscepticism, in places like Britain and Denmark and Sweden.
Right. So it's a mixed bag.
It is. It's very complex.
Now, switching gears completely.
Okay.
Let's look at Southeast Asia.
Asian.
Okay, yeah.
Good idea.
What a contrast, right?
It is a huge contrast.
Completely different approach.
So ASEAN starts in 1967 with the Bangkok Declaration. It was Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand.
Right.
And their goal at the start, it was mostly about boosting economic growth, social progress, trying to stabilize the region after colonialism and the pressures of the Cold War.
Right.
And over time, they've expanded to 10 members.
And their whole ASEAN way, it's fascinating.
It is very different.
It's informal, it's cooperative, they really prioritize consensus.
Yeah.
And I think a key difference here, they emphasize respecting each nation's sovereignty.
Huge difference from the EU's approach.
Right. The EU is moving towards more shared authority, whereas ASEAN is like, no. We all keep our own power.
Each nation calls the shots.
Exactly. And they started with economic and social goals, but then they broadened their vision.
Yeah, it became much more ambitious.
Leading to the ASEAN community in 2003.
Right, which has these 3 pillars: security, economic, and sociocultural.
And a big part of that security pillar, it's about keeping those territorial disputes from boiling over.
Exactly, trying to promote peace in the region.
Which is why they have the ASEAN Regional Forum, right?
Right.
For those security discussions.
Yeah, it's their platform for dialogue.
Now, economically, ASEAN is a really interesting story.
It is. They're dynamic.
I mean, these are fast-growing economies.
Yeah.
They're becoming key trade and investment partners.
Especially for India and China.
Exactly. And they're aiming for a common market through the ASEAN Economic Community and their free trade area.
That's a big goal.
It is, and it shows how ambitious they are.
Yeah.
And you see that in India's Look East and Act East policies, it's all about engaging with ASEAN more and more.
It makes sense. They're becoming increasingly important.
Okay, so we've talked about the EU, we've talked about ASEAN.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, or maybe the dragon in the room.
Okay.
China.
China, yeah.
Their economic rise is just, remarkable, doesn't even begin to cover it.
It's phenomenal, the transformation since the 1949 revolution.
Yeah, and at first they were following that Soviet model, right?
Right, state-controlled heavy industry, focus on agriculture.
Which, it had its limits.
It did. Growth was slow. They weren't really trading much globally.
Right, and people's incomes were low.
And agricultural production wasn't keeping up with demand.
But then, the 1970s, things start to shift.
Big time.
They opened relations with the U.S. in '72. That was a big deal.
It broke their isolation, opened up possibilities.
Then you've got Zhu Enlai's 4 modernizations in '73. That was kind of laying the groundwork.
Modernizing agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology, ambitious goals.
And then Deng Xiaoping comes in with his open door policy in '78.
And that changed everything.
That was the real game changer. Suddenly, foreign investment in technology started pouring in.
It was like flipping a switch.
But their move to a market economy, it wasn't overnight.
No, it was very gradual, very deliberate.
They privatized agriculture in '82 and then industry later on.
Right, and they set up these special economic zones to experiment with market-based approaches.
But the state was always there, guiding things.
Absolutely, it was a controlled transition.
And the impact was,
Incredible.
agriculture took off, rural industries blossomed, the entire economy was growing at an incredible pace.
And they became a major player in global trade.
Their foreign trade just exploded.
Yeah, and they became a magnet for foreign investment.
Right, building up huge foreign currency reserves.
And joining the WTO in 2001, that really signaled their global ambitions.
They wanted to shape the world economic order.
They wanted a seat at the table, and they got it.
But it hasn't all been easy. Right?
Of course not. This kind of rapid growth, it comes with challenges.
Like what?
Well, you've got rising unemployment, issues with working conditions, especially for women,
Yeah.
environmental problems, pollution,
Right.
corruption, and a growing gap between the rich and the poor.
So these internal issues, they could affect how they play on the world stage.
Absolutely. They're definitely factors to watch.
Now let's zoom out a bit.
Okay.
Talk about China's regional and global influence. Economically, they're just so intertwined with their trading partners now, it's created this interdependence.
Which has actually helped to smooth over some disputes in some cases.
Yeah, and they're really pushing for closer ties with Taiwan, especially on the economic front.
Right, trying to integrate them.
And you can't forget their role in stabilizing ASEAN after the '97 financial crisis.
They stepped up.
And they're investing more and more in Latin America and Africa.
Yeah, expanding their influence.
Okay, one last thing before we wrap up.
Okay.
India-China relations.
Right, always an interesting topic.
Historically, they were both these major Asian powers, but they didn't interact all that much.
No, there was a lot of distance.
And after independence, there was this hope for cooperation. That Hindi Chini bye-bye spirit.
Motherhood, right.
Yeah, but then the 1962 border conflict happened.
Which really cast a shadow over everything.
It really did. Took a long time to recover from that.
It did. It was a major setback.
But things started to improve slowly from the late 70s.
They adopted a more pragmatic approach.
And Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China in '88, that was a turning point,
Yeah, it opened the door for more dialogue.
leading to more trade, cultural exchanges, all that.
And they actually cooperate in some international economic forums now.
Which is pretty amazing considering their history.
It is. It shows how far they've come.
But there are still those points of friction, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The border disputes, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, there are different stances on counterterrorism at the UN.
Yeah, those are all potential flashpoints.
So I guess the takeaway here is that the EU, ASEAN, and China, they've all become these major forces in the world.
Yeah, shaping the global landscape.
But they've taken very different paths with their own strengths and weaknesses.
And their own challenges.
So here's something to think about. Given their unique approaches to regionalism and economic growth, which of these models, if any, do you think offers the best path towards a more stable and prosperous world?
That's a great question.
It is something to think about, especially as the world becomes more and more multipolar.
Definitely something to ponder.
All right, that's all the time we have for today.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been great.
It has.
Until next time.
All right, see you then.
Chapter 3. Contemporary South Asia.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We got a ton of requests to really dig into South Asia. And, well, I've got to say, same here. It's a region that I find super fascinating. And we've got a really great chapter here to kind of guide us through this deep dive. It gives us a nice overview of contemporary South Asia, covering everything from the political systems of these different countries to, conflicts that are going on within and between those nations and, how all of that kind of fits into this broader global context. Really, our mission here is to, go deeper than the headlines, get past those surface level understandings of, what's going on in South Asia, really unpack these complexities and try to identify those, those big themes and forces that are shaping this region.
Yeah, absolutely. And right off the bat, I think what's really striking is how South Asia is even defined, right?
Yeah.
Like, where does it begin and end? This chapter, it pretty clearly lays out, that core group of countries.
Yeah.
You've got Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And, what's interesting is that the geography itself has kind of created this, natural insularity, right? I mean, you think about the Himalayas and the seas surrounding it, it's kind of given this region a distinct identity. But then, things get a little bit less clear when you go to the east and the west, right? Because you have Afghanistan and Myanmar, and they're often included in these broader discussions, but it's a little bit fuzzy.
Yeah, well, and even when you look at how these different nations govern themselves, I mean, it's amazing how much variety there is, right? I mean, Sri Lanka and India, for example, they really stand out because they've had this consistent experience with democracy, ever since they gained their independence. That's not an easy feat.
No, not at all.
Then you have Pakistan and Bangladesh, and, they've kind of gone back and forth between these periods of civilian rule and military rule, right? But both of them have really leaned more towards that democratic path, especially in the, post-Cold War period. And then you have Nepal's transition in 2008 from a constitutional monarchy to a democratic republic. And, the same year, Bhutan became a constitutional monarchy, and the Maldives went from a sultanate to a republic and introduced a multi-party system, I think, back in 2005. So it's really this constantly evolving political landscape.
Yeah. And what I think is so fascinating is, despite all of these different pathways and experiences with, democratic institutions and forms of government, there's this really strong underlying current of support for democracy across these, 5 biggest countries,
Yeah.
Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And, the chapter really emphasizes how this support, it cuts across socioeconomic lines and even religious affiliations. So it's not just, tied to one particular segment of the population. It's really this widespread belief that democracy is the right fit for their countries. And I think that really makes you think about, just how resilient this aspiration for democracy really is in the face of all these other challenges that they're facing.
Well, and speaking of challenges, I mean, we have to talk about the India-Pakistan relationship. I mean, the chapter makes it very clear that this is like the central international issue in the region,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
And it all stems from, that partition and the unresolved status of Kashmir, right? You
Mhm.
effectively have this former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir that was divided between India and Pakistan by that line of control. And it's been a source of conflict, since the very beginning. I mean,
Wow.
we've seen major wars in, 47, 48, 65, and then the 1971 war. And then on top of all that, both countries developed nuclear weapons in 1998. So, that has definitely changed the whole strategic equation there. It's probably made large-scale conflict less likely, but it definitely hasn't gotten rid of that, mutual suspicion between the two.
Hmm.
I mean, the chapter talks about how both sides are constantly accusing each other of supporting militants, and, you know, it's amazing to me that the Indus Waters Treaty, which was signed back in 1960, has actually survived all this, even though they've had their, minor disagreements over how to interpret it.
It's really quite incredible.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting because if you take that central, dynamic and kind of build out from it, you see how India's relationships with its other neighbors also have their own, unique complexities. Like take Bangladesh, for instance.
Uh-huh.
They do cooperate on a lot of things like
Mm.
economic matters, disaster response. They even exchanged those enclaves a while back. But then they have these persistent disagreements over things like, how to share river water, illegal immigration, accusations of support for anti-Indian groups, and even some trade issues. And then you look at India and Nepal. They share this, really unique open border. They have this work agreement for their citizens, which you don't see that very often.
No.
But even there, you have these historical trade disputes that keep coming up. And India has concerns about Nepal's relationship with China and alleged anti-Indian activities. And then, of course, Nepal has their own concerns about Indian interference, particularly when it comes to things like water resources and access to the sea.
Right.
And even with Sri Lanka, where they do have a free trade agreement and they've cooperated on things like tsunami relief, there's still this underlying tension stemming from that ethnic conflict involving the Tamils.
Right.
India was directly involved in that at one point and then kind of pulled back.
Yeah.
But it's definitely had a lasting impact on the relationship. But then, in contrast to all of that, you have India's relationship with Bhutan and the Maldives, which are much closer, a lot more cooperation on security and development initiatives.
Yeah, it really is this whole patchwork of relationships, and it speaks to, the potential for regional cooperation, but also the real difficulties that they face.
Absolutely.
And, I think the chapter does a good job of highlighting this, right? Like, they talk about SARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which was formed back in 1985. The whole idea was to really boost economic, social, cultural collaboration, really strengthen those ties within the region. And then in 2006, they created SAFTA, the South Asian Free Trade Area, which was supposed to lower trade tariffs. But, as the chapter points out, those political differences, especially between India and Pakistan, have really hindered SARC's effectiveness.
Yeah.
And, you can understand why the smaller nations in the region might be a little bit wary of India's economic dominance, right? I mean, it's a huge economy. But despite all of that, there have been these consistent efforts to kind of move towards peace through different channels like confidence-building measures, people-to-people initiatives, leadership summits. But, as we've seen recently, there have been some pretty significant setbacks, too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what's also really interesting to think about is how these external powers are playing into this whole regional dynamic.
Right.
You've got China on the one hand with its strategic partnership with Pakistan, and at the same time, it's got these growing economic ties with India.
Right.
And then you have the United States. And, relations have been improving with both India and Pakistan. There's a sense that the U.S. could potentially play a role as a moderator. Plus, the U.S. is becoming more and more economically involved in the region. So it's really a multi-layered situation,
Yeah, no kidding. And I think at the end of the day, what the chapter really suggests is that, the future of South Asia, whether it's going to be marked by conflict or cooperation, really hinges on the actions of its own people and governments, more than these external forces. So, considering everything we've talked about, all these intricate relationships and these internal dynamics, what's one internal factor that you found particularly surprising or maybe even unexpected that's really shaping these international relationships? And, what implications do you think that has for the region's long-term stability?
Wow, that's a big question. I think
Chapter 4. International organizations.
Ever get that feeling?
Yeah.
Like the world's problems are just too massive, too complicated for any single country to tackle.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Well, today, on this deep dive, we're going to use the materials you sent us to really try and wrap our heads around those international organizations, the ones that exist to, well, deal with those huge global issues.
Right.
We're going to mainly focus on the UN, of course.
Big player.
Big player, for sure. But we'll also touch on some of the other key players in that space.
Absolutely. Like the IMF, the World Trade Organization.
Right, the WTO, yeah. And
IAEA.
the IAEA,
Yep.
exactly. Now, our aim here, and I think this reflects what you were interested in, is to really extract the most important insights about these organizations. What's their core purpose? What are some of the challenges they're grappling with? And I guess most importantly, what impact are they actually having?
Right. What are they doing?
Yeah, what are they doing? And we also want to look at how the global landscape has shifted, especially since the UN's founding. I mean, think about it. The world's a very different place than it was back then.
It really is. Back in, what was it, 1945?
1945, yeah. And, this whole question of reforming these institutions, it's a big debate, and we'll definitely delve into that.
Yeah, a lot of people are asking if these organizations are still fit for purpose in the 21st century.
Exactly. So let's jump right in, shall we? Let's start with why these international organizations even exist in the first place.
Good place to start. So you shared some interesting cartoons.
Yeah, I thought they were quite striking, actually.
They were, and they kind of poked fun at the UN's, shall we say, ineffectiveness.
Yeah, they kind of made it look a bit useless.
Right. And that criticism is out there. We can't ignore it. But there's another way of looking at it.
Okay, yeah. Tell me more.
Well, think about that quote from Dag Hammarskjöld, the former UN Secretary General. He said the UN was created to save humanity from hell, not to take it to heaven.
That's pretty powerful.
Right. And Shashi Tharoor, he had another great way of putting it. He said, jaw is better than war.
Jaw is better than war. Okay, I like that.
Meaning, it's always better to talk things out, to find common ground, than to resort to violence.
Makes sense.
And that's fundamentally what these organizations are all about.
Okay, so they provide a platform for, peaceful dialogue and finding solutions.
Exactly. A neutral space where countries can come together, air their grievances, hash things out, and hopefully prevent conflicts from escalating.
Right. And it's not just about preventing wars, is it? I mean, there are so many other global challenges that require, global cooperation.
Absolutely. Things like disease outbreaks, climate change, poverty. These are issues that transcend national borders. No single country can solve them alone.
Right. These are global problems that need global solutions.
Precisely. And these organizations, they provide the framework for that collective action.
Okay. So I guess it's important to remember that these organizations, they're not like super states or anything.
No, they're created by states, by the member countries. And they're ultimately accountable to those states.
Right. So it's a collaborative effort.
Exactly. A partnership of sorts.
Okay. So let's zoom in on the UN specifically. I mean, it's arguably the most well-known of these international organizations.
For sure. It's often seen as, the flagship organization.
Right. And its history is kind of interesting, right? I mean, it wasn't the first attempt at creating a global body like this.
It wasn't. The League of Nations, which was formed after World War I.
Yeah, that was the predecessor, right?
It was, but it ultimately failed.
It did. It couldn't prevent World War II.
Sadly not. And that's why, in 1945, in the aftermath of that devastating war, world leaders came together determined to create something more effective.
And that's how the UN was born.
Exactly. With 51 member states initially.
Okay, and what were the main goals? I mean, what were they hoping to achieve with the UN?
Well, fundamentally, it was about preventing another world war.
Okay, avoiding another global conflict. That makes sense.
Right. But it was also about fostering cooperation, working together to address social and economic problems, to improve living standards worldwide.
So peace and progress, basically.
Exactly. And to achieve those goals, they set up a pretty complex structure.
Right. There's the General Assembly, where every member state has a seat and gets one vote.
Right. The big forum for discussion and debate.
Yeah. And then there's the Security Council, which is kind of like the powerful decision-making body.
Right. And it's important to remember that the Security Council has 5 permanent members.
The big 5.
Exactly. The U.S., Russia, the UK, France, and China. And they each have veto power.
Meaning they can block any resolution.
Exactly. And then there are 10 non-permanent members who serve 2-year terms.
Okay. And then there's the Secretary General. Who's that?
That's kind of like the CEO of the UN. The current one is Antonio Guterres.
Okay. So we've got this structure in place, and it's working, I guess, for a while. But then the world starts changing.
Right. A lot happened in the late 20th century. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed.
Right. And that shifted the balance of power, didn't it?
It did. The U.S. emerged as the sole superpower.
And then you have new global challenges emerging. Things like genocide, terrorism, climate change. Issues that weren't really on the radar back in 1945.
Exactly. And all of this led to calls for reform. People started questioning whether the UN, in its current form, was really equipped to deal with these new realities.
Right. So what kind of reforms were people talking about?
Well, there were two main areas of focus. One was reforming the organizational structures and processes of the UN, making it more efficient, more transparent, more accountable.
Okay, streamlining the bureaucracy.
Exactly. And the other focus was on the issues the UN addresses, expanding its mandate to include these new global challenges.
Right, adapting to a changing world.
Exactly. And one of the most heated debates centered on the Security Council.
Oh, yeah, the Security Council. That seems to be a major sticking point.
It is. A lot of countries feel that its composition is outdated and unfair.
Okay, how so?
Well, for one thing, it doesn't reflect the current distribution of power in the world. The 5 permanent members are all Western powers.
Right, and they've held that position since 1945.
Exactly. And a lot of countries, especially in Asia, Africa, and South America, feel that they're underrepresented.
They want a seat at the table.
Precisely. They want more influence in global decision-making.
Okay, so have there been any concrete proposals for reforming the Security Council?
There have. There have been lots of ideas floating around. Some people have suggested adding new permanent members.
Okay, so expanding the Big Five.
Right. But then the question is, who gets those seats? And what criteria do you use to decide?
Yeah, that's tricky.
It is. Some people have suggested looking at things like economic power, military power, contributions to the UN budget, population size.
Okay, so basically the heavy hitters.
Right. Others have argued that you should also consider things like respect for democracy and human rights, geographic diversity, cultural diversity.
So a more holistic approach.
Exactly. But the problem is there's no consensus on which criteria are most important. And then there's the whole issue of veto power.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is. Some countries argue that any new permanent members should also have veto power.
Okay, so equal status.
Right. But others say that would just make the Security Council even more unwieldy and difficult to reach decisions.
Yeah, I can see that.
So yeah, reforming the Security Council, it's a tough nut to crack.
Definitely a complex issue.
It is, but it's an important one because the Security Council has a huge impact on global peace and security.
Right. It's the one that can authorize military interventions, impose sanctions.
Exactly. It has a lot of power, so it's important to make sure that power is used responsibly and fairly.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about the UN, but there are other important international organizations out there, right?
Absolutely. There's a whole alphabet soup of them. But let's focus on a few key ones.
Okay.
So there's the IMF, the International Monetary Fund.
Right, I've heard of that.
They basically oversee the global financial system. They provide loans to countries facing economic difficulties.
Okay, so they're like the lender of last resort.
Kind of, yeah. But they also have a lot of influence over economic policies in those countries.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, they often attach conditions to their loans. They might say, we'll give you this money, but you have to cut spending or privatize certain industries.
They have a lot of leverage.
They do. And that's one of the criticisms of the IMF. Some people argue that they're too powerful, that they impose policies that hurt the poor and benefit the rich.
Interesting.
And there's also the issue of voting power. The U.S., for example, has a lot more voting power than, say, a small developing country.
So it's not a level playing field.
It's not, and that's something that a lot of countries are unhappy about.
Okay. What about the World Bank?
The World Bank is more focused on development.
Okay.
They provide loans and grants to developing countries to help them build infrastructure, improve education, healthcare, things like that.
So they're trying to, lift people out of poverty.
Exactly. And they've had some successes, but they've also been criticized for, some of their projects having negative social and environmental impacts.
Okay. So good intentions, but not always perfect execution.
Right. And then there's the WTO, the World Trade Organization.
Okay, tell me about them.
They set the rules for global trade.
Okay, so they're trying to make sure that trade is fair and free.
In theory, yes. But in practice, it's a lot more complicated than that.
How so?
Well, there are a lot of disputes between countries about, tariffs, subsidies, intellectual property rights.
Okay, so it's about protecting national interests.
It is. And developing countries often feel that the WTO rules are biased against them.
Okay, so there's some tension there.
There is. And then finally, there's the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Okay, and what do they do?
They promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy,
Okay,
but they also work to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons.
so a very important role.
Extremely important. They conduct inspections. They try to make sure that countries are complying with international treaties.
Right, keeping the world safe from nuclear proliferation.
Exactly. So as you can see, these international organizations, they play a vital role in addressing global challenges.
Right, and they're all interconnected in a way.
They are. They often have to work together to solve problems.
Okay, now you mentioned earlier that India is pushing for a bigger role in the UN.
They are. They've been quite vocal about it.
Okay, and what's their argument?
Well, for one thing, India is the world's largest democracy.
Right, and they have a huge population.
Over 1.3 billion people. And they've been a major contributor to UN peacekeeping missions.
Okay, so they're pulling their weight.
They are. And their economy has been growing rapidly.
Right, they're a rising power.
Exactly. So they feel that they deserve a permanent seat on the Security Council.
Okay, I can see their point.
Right. But as with everything in international relations, it's not that simple.
Right, there are other factors at play.
There are. Some countries oppose India's bid for a permanent seat.
Okay, why is that?
Well, there are a few reasons. One is India's relationship with Pakistan.
Ah, yeah, the long-standing rivalry.
Exactly. They've fought several wars, and Pakistan is unlikely to support India's bid.
Okay, and I guess India's nuclear program is another concern.
It is. India developed nuclear weapons in the late 1990s.
Right, and they haven't signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Exactly. So some countries worry about giving them a permanent seat on the Security Council.
Okay, so it's a sensitive issue.
It is. And then there's the question of, well, if you let India in, who else do you let in?
Ah, yeah, that's the slippery slope argument.
Right. If you expand the Security Council to include India, then other countries like Brazil, Germany, Japan, they're all going to want a seat too.
Right, so it opens up a whole can of worms.
It does. So it's a very complex debate with no easy answers.
It seems like a lot of these global issues are like that.
They are. They're multifaceted. They involve a lot of different actors, a lot of competing interests.
Right. Okay, so one final question. In this world where we have one dominant superpower, the U.S.,
Yeah.
can the UN really balance that power? I mean, the U.S. has a lot of influence within the UN.
They do. They're the biggest financial contributor. The UN headquarters is in New York.
Right, and they have veto power.
Exactly. So it's clear that the U.S. has a lot of sway.
Right, but does that mean the UN is just a puppet of the U.S.?
I wouldn't say that. I think the UN still plays a crucial role in facilitating dialogue, bringing countries together to discuss issues, to try and find common ground.
Okay, so it's a forum for discussion, even if those discussions don't always lead to concrete action.
Right. And the UN can also help to shape global opinion. If there's a consensus among UN member states on a particular issue, that can put pressure on the U.S. to change its policy.
Okay, so it's not powerless.
It's not. It's a complex institution with a lot of limitations, but it's still an important player on the global stage.
Right. I think we can all agree on that. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion.
It has. These organizations, they're messy, they're imperfect, but they're trying to grapple with some of the biggest challenges facing humanity.
Exactly. And it's important for us to understand how they work, what their strengths and weaknesses are, so that we can hold them accountable and push for positive change.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, the debate over their reform is ongoing. It's a reflection of the shifting power dynamics in the world and the need to adapt to new threats and opportunities.
Right. And I guess it raises a lot of questions for all of us.
It does. So here's a thought for you to chew on. Given all the criteria we've discussed for Security Council membership, economic power, military might, democracy, human rights, which one do you think is the most crucial in today's world?
It's a tough one.
It is. And why might your choice be controversial?
That's something for our listeners to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been enlightening.
It has indeed.
See you next time.
See ya.
Chapter 5. Security in the Contemporary World.
Okay, so you wanted to really get into what security actually means and specifically how it all applies to India's situation. And I know you're looking for clarity without getting too bogged down in the jargon.
Absolutely.
So let's dive right into this chapter that you sent me.
Sounds good.
It lays out two main ways of thinking about this whole security thing, traditional and non-traditional.
Yeah.
So what's the big difference? Like, what are we really talking about here?
Well, you see, traditional security, it's mostly been about the state, the country itself,
Right.
as the thing that needs protecting, and mainly from military threats coming from outside its borders.
Makes sense.
So we're talking about another country's military posing a threat.
Right.
And these threats, they're seen as really dangerous to a nation's whole existence. Its sovereignty,
Yeah.
independence, territorial integrity, all of that.
Like the core stuff.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And then non-traditional security. That kind of widens the scope significantly.
Okay, so let's say a country feels threatened in this traditional way, like they see another country's military as a real danger. What are their options? What can they do?
Well, the chapter outlines three main responses.
Okay.
One is surrender, though you will never really hear a country say that publicly.
Right.
Then there's deterrence, which is all about making an attack too costly,
Showing force.
basically.
Yeah.
Making it clear that attacking would be a really bad idea.
Right.
And then the third option is defense, actually fighting back if you get attacked.
Okay, so in this kind of system where there's no global police force to guarantee everyone's safety, a really important concept comes into play.
Exactly.
This whole balance of power idea,
Yeah.
right? Where countries are always sizing each other up.
That's it. It's all about keeping an eye on everyone else's strength.
Right, and probably trying to match it or even surpass it.
Exactly. And that leads to countries building up their military, their economy, their technology, trying to become as powerful as they can.
Exactly.
And forming alliances, too, those formal agreements between countries to deter or defend against attacks. That's another big part of this traditional security approach.
So it's all about power and alliances.
In a nutshell, yeah.
Okay, so it's interesting, though, that while the big powers were mostly focused on these external threats after World War II, a lot of newly independent countries were facing danger from within,
That's a really important point.
like internal peace being just as important as protecting your borders.
Absolutely.
And for many countries in Asia and Africa, the threats from inside, like separatist movements or internal conflicts, those were actually bigger worries
They were more immediate and pressing concerns, for sure.
than some far-off external threat.
Definitely.
But even within this traditional security view, there's still this idea of cooperation, right? It's not just every country for themselves.
You're right. It's not all about national self-interest.
So there is some recognition that countries need to work together to limit the damage of conflict.
Right. And that leads to agreements on what are justifiable reasons for war, things like self-defense or preventing genocide.
Okay, so there are some rules of the game.
Yeah, and there are also agreements on the means of warfare, like trying to avoid harming civilians.
Right, trying to minimize the damage.
Exactly.
And then there are things like disarmament, arms control, confidence building, measures, all those efforts to make things a bit safer.
Right, so disarmament is about giving up certain weapons altogether, like biological or chemical weapons, and arms control is more about regulating the development of weapons, like through treaties.
Like the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Exactly, that's a big one aimed at stopping the spread of nuclear weapons.
Right, and confidence building measures. Those are more about sharing information and being transparent.
Exactly, like sharing military information to try and prevent misunderstandings and reduce tensions.
So those are all important parts of traditional security.
They are key elements.
Okay, so let's move on to non-traditional security now. This one seems like a real shift in perspective.
It really broadens our understanding of what security means.
Because now we're not just looking at the state itself.
Right. The focus shifts away from just the country and expands to include individuals and all of humanity.
It's about people.
Yes. And the threats that are considered, they go way beyond just military aggression now.
Anything that threatens human existence is on the table.
Pretty much.
Wow. So that brings us to human security and global security.
Right.
And human security has kind of a narrow view that focuses on violence, but also a broader view that includes things like poverty, disease, and natural disasters.
Exactly. And these non-military threats, they can be just as devastating as any war.
Right. And the broader view of human security, it emphasizes freedom from want and freedom from fear.
Two really important concepts.
And then global security that takes on these worldwide issues like climate change, international terrorism, pandemics, all those things that require countries to work together.
Exactly, because no single country can solve those problems on their own.
So for something to be considered a security issue in this broader sense, it needs to be a real existential threat.
It has to threaten the very existence of the referent, whether that's a state or people.
Right, but the specifics of what that threat looks like, it varies depending on the context.
Of course, for example, rising sea levels are a huge threat to a low-lying island nation like the Maldives.
Right, that's an existential threat for them.
But it might not be seen as such a big deal for a landlocked country.
And then you have things like HIV/AIDS, which has been a devastating security issue in Southern Africa.
Absolutely. And genocide, like what happened in Rwanda, that's another example of a very specific security threat.
So with these new threats, it's clear that tackling them requires more than just military might.
Right. Traditional military solutions don't always work in these situations.
And the chapter talks about this idea of cooperative security.
Yeah, that's key for addressing these non-traditional threats.
Because it involves collaboration across a whole range of actors.
It's not just governments anymore. It's international organizations, NGOs, businesses, even individuals all working together.
So it's a much more complex landscape.
Definitely.
And while military force might still be an option in some cases, the preferred approach is usually collective action.
Like for issues like poverty migration, global health crises, things like that.
Right. Those are problems that need cooperation and coordination to solve.
Exactly.
Okay, so finally the chapter touches on India's security strategy.
Right, and it's a really interesting case.
Because it seems to be a blend of these traditional and non-traditional approaches.
It is. India is in a unique position facing both internal and external challenges.
So on the one hand, they're strengthening their military capabilities.
Which makes sense given their history and their neighbors, some of whom have nuclear weapons.
Right, so they need to be able to defend themselves.
Absolutely. But at the same time, they're also actively involved in trying to strengthen international norms and institutions.
So they're engaging in diplomacy and working within the international system.
Exactly. They're supporting disarmament efforts, participating in UN peacekeeping missions, pushing for a new international economic order.
So they're playing on both fields.
They are, and they're also focusing on economic development as a way to address internal vulnerabilities like poverty and inequality.
So it's a multi-pronged approach.
Very much so.
So as you can see, the whole idea of security is incredibly complex.
It's much more than just about tanks and missiles.
It's about people and their well-being. It's about global issues that affect us all.
It's a much broader concept than it used to be.
And moving from that traditional state-centered military focus to a more holistic view that includes human and global well-being that gives us a much richer way to analyze the challenges we face today.
I agree. It's a more comprehensive perspective.
And I think the interconnectedness of all these non-traditional threats, it really underscores the importance of working together.
It highlights the need for cooperation and collaboration.
Because these problems, they don't respect borders.
They don't, and they affect us all.
It really makes you think about how we balance national interests with these global challenges, doesn't it?
It does. It's a question that we all need to grapple with.
It's a tough one, but it's one that we can't ignore.
Absolutely not.
So I think that's a good place to leave it for today.
I agree.
But it definitely gives us a lot to think about.
It does food for thought, for sure.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
You're welcome. It was a great discussion.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into a topic that matters.
Looking forward to it.
Until then, take care.
You too.
Chapter 6. Environment and Natural Resources.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know, when we talk about global politics, things can get pretty complex pretty fast.
Oh, absolutely. It's a tangled web for sure.
But today, we're looking at something that, at first glance, might seem a bit removed from all those treaties and negotiations and summits. We're talking about the environment. But as we'll see from the sources we've got lined up, environmental issues are anything but a sideshow in global politics. In fact, they're increasingly front and center.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, it's easy to think of environmental problems as purely scientific, something for the ecologists and the geographers to figure out. But the sources we've got paint a very different picture.
So our mission today is to really understand why environmental concerns has moved from, let's say, the periphery to the very core of world affairs and what the big debates are all about. And full disclosure, we're dealing with a bunch of different perspectives here, some of them quite strongly worded. But our job, as always, is to present those viewpoints fairly, not to pick sides.
Exactly. We're here to map the landscape, not to plant our flag on any particular hill.
Right. Now, one of the first things that struck me as we were prepping for this deep dive was the sheer scale of the environmental challenges we're talking about.
Oh, without a doubt. We're talking about pollution that affects entire continents, resources like fertile land and clean water that are becoming more and more scarce, deforestation impacting climate and biodiversity. It's a global tapestry, really.
And it's not just about, trees and rivers. These issues have very real consequences for people's lives. The sources actually point out that millions of people die every year because they don't have access to safe water and sanitation.
It's a stark reminder that environmental degradation is not just an abstract concept. It has devastating human costs. And when you think about it, the sources highlight how these problems transcend national borders. Pollution doesn't respect boundaries, and the impact of climate change is felt worldwide.
Okay, so we're talking about huge issues, issues that clearly require governments to step in. But where does the politics part really come in?
Well, it's all about the power dynamics. Who's responsible for the pollution? Who ends up paying the price? Who gets to decide how resources are used? These questions are fundamentally political.
And the sources make it clear that there's a long history here. Environmental awareness wasn't always what it is today.
True. But things really started to shift in the 1960s. That's when we saw a surge in concern about the environmental impact of industrialization and population growth. A landmark moment was the publication of Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome in 1972.
Which, if I remember correctly, warned that if we continued consuming resources at the current rate, we would eventually hit a point of no return.
Yeah, it was a wake-up call, and it had a huge impact. In the years that followed, we saw the creation of international organizations like UMP to try and coordinate a global response to these challenges.
Yeah.
And then came the big one, the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio.
Rio was a turning point. It really solidified the environment as a central issue in global politics, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It brought together leaders from all over the world to discuss these issues and try to come up with solutions. But it also exposed a fundamental divide.
The so-called North-South divide.
Precisely. The sources highlight how developed countries, the global north, often focused on issues like ozone depletion and global warming, which were seen as more immediate threats to their own well-being.
And meanwhile, developing countries, the global south, were more concerned with the link between economic development and environmental protection. I mean, they're still trying to lift millions of people out of poverty.
Right, and they argue that they shouldn't be held to the same environmental standards as countries that had already industrialized and polluted their way to prosperity.
This is where the concept of sustainable development comes in.
Yes, sustainable development, the idea of balancing economic growth with environmental protection. It became a key theme at Rio and in subsequent global discussions. But as the sources point out, actually putting it into practice is another story. There's a lot of debate about what it really means and how to achieve it.
Okay, so we've got this north-south divide, we've got these huge global environmental challenges, and then there's the issue of resources. Who controls them? Who gets to use them?
That's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah.
The sources actually talk about the concept of global commons, resources that are outside the jurisdiction of any single state.
Like the atmosphere, the oceans, Antarctica, outer space, these sorts of things.
Exactly. And the question is, how do you manage these shared spaces? How do you ensure that everyone benefits and that no one country is exploiting them at the expense of others?
The sources point to some examples of international cooperation, like the Antarctic Treaty, which basically sets aside Antarctica for peaceful scientific research. But they also highlight the challenges.
Absolutely. I mean, look at outer space. There's a lot of talk about space exploration and even space mining. But who gets to set the rules? Who benefits from these activities? These are tough questions, and they often come down to existing inequalities between countries, particularly those with advanced technology and those without.
You know, one phrase that keeps coming up in the sources is common but differentiated responsibilities. It sounds kind of technical, but it seems to be at the heart of a lot of these debates.
It is a bit of a mouthful, but it's a crucial concept. It basically acknowledges that developed countries bear a greater historical responsibility for environmental degradation because of their industrial past. So they should take the lead in addressing these problems.
And that developing countries, while still needing to do their part, shouldn't face the same restrictions, especially when they're trying to improve the lives of their citizens.
Right. The sources actually use the Kyoto Protocol as an example. This was an international agreement aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But it initially exempted countries like India and China from specific emission targets.
India's position on this is particularly interesting. They're very vocal about the need for developed countries to own up to their historical responsibility.
And they argue that economic and social development should be their top priority, which makes sense given the scale of poverty they're still grappling with. But that doesn't mean they're ignoring the environmental challenge.
Right. The sources point to a number of initiatives that India has taken, like their national auto fuel policy, which promotes cleaner fuels, and their huge investments in renewable energy. And they've also ratified the Paris Agreement, the global deal on climate change, so they're definitely engaged.
And it's not just governments that are driving change. The sources also highlight the role of environmental movements, and there's a huge diversity there.
I mean, we've got everything from grassroots campaigns to international NGOs, and they're tackling a wide range of issues.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the concept of environment can mean different things to different people. In the Global South, for example, many environmental movements are led by communities who live and depend on forests for their livelihoods. So their understanding of wilderness is very different from the kind of pristine, untouched nature that's often imagined in the North.
The sources also talk about resistance to big mining corporations, particularly in countries where mining has a history of environmental damage and social disruption. There were notable cases in the Philippines and Australia, for example.
And then you've got movements like the Narmada Bacao Andolan in India, which campaigned against the construction of large dams. They argued that these dams displaced communities and had a devastating impact on the local environment.
Now, we can't talk about global politics without talking about resources. And the sources make it clear that access to resources has been a major driver of conflict and cooperation throughout history.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the role of oil. Control over oil resources, particularly in West Asia, has shaped global alliances and fueled political instability for decades. And it continues to be a major factor today.
And then there's water, which is becoming increasingly scarce in many parts of the world. We're already seeing tensions between countries that share river systems or underground aquifers, and these disputes could easily escalate into full-blown conflicts in the future.
It's a recipe for trouble, for sure. And speaking of resource conflicts, the sources also bring in the perspective of indigenous peoples. These are communities that have lived in close connection with the natural world for centuries, often in areas that are rich in resources.
But they're also often marginalized, and their rights are ignored when it comes to decisions about how those resources are used.
Exactly. For indigenous peoples, losing their land isn't just an economic issue, it's an existential threat. It's about the destruction of their culture, their way of life. And the sources point to the World Council of Indigenous Peoples as an example of an organization that's fighting for their rights and recognition on the global stage.
In India, for example, there's a long history of conflict between indigenous communities, often referred to as scheduled tribes, and the government over land rights and development projects.
It's a complex and often tragic story, and it really highlights the interconnectedness of environmental issues, resource politics, and human rights.
So it's clear from this deep dive that the environment is not some separate issue that we can deal with later. It's woven into the very fabric of global politics.
And it raises some really tough questions. Questions about responsibility, about power, about how we manage our shared planet in a way that's fair and sustainable for everyone.
And for me, one of the most thought-provoking aspects of this whole discussion is this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. How do we actually put that principle into practice in a way that balances the needs of developed and developing countries and also takes into account the rights of indigenous peoples?
Yeah, it's a crucial question. And I think it's one that we as citizens need to engage with more deeply.
Yeah.
Because ultimately the choices we make, both individually and collectively, will determine the future of our planet.
Couldn't said it better myself. So much to think about. So much to do. That's it for this week's Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.
Chapter 7. Globalization.
All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling, pretty big topic, globalization.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It really is. And you were kind enough to share some excerpts from a contemporary world politics textbook to help us out. And it really seems like it covers a lot, so we're going to try to unpack the core ideas and controversies, around this whole idea of an interconnected world.
Right.
So we'll look at how this book, how it defines globalization, what causes it,
Yeah.
the impact on, politics and economics,
Okay.
and even culture, with a specific look at India.
Right.
And we'll even dive into some of the resistance that this whole idea faces. So it's a lot to cover.
It is. You've given me a lot of great material here, and we'll try to break it down for you.
All right, let's just jump right into it. The textbook starts off with a few, just examples to kind of set the stage. You've got Janardhan, who's working in a call center, talking to clients in the U.S., Ramdari buying goods from China in the U.S., and then Sarika, who's got these big career aspirations, right? So what's the common thread here? What are they getting at with these examples about globalization?
Well, I think they really illustrate the core idea of globalization, which is this growing interconnectedness. I mean, worldwide interconnectedness. Janardhan's job, right? That shows how services are crossing borders.
Right.
And then you've got Ramdari's purchases, which are a perfect example of the flow of goods from different parts of the world.
Yeah.
And Sarika's aspirations, I think, reflect this spread of ideas and values.
Right, like this globalized sort of perspective.
Exactly. It's really this increasing movement of not just ideas, but money, products, and even people, right? That's really what defines globalization.
But it feels like a very modern thing, but the book makes a point of saying it's not totally new. Is that right?
You're absolutely right. Yeah. While these global connections have existed, I mean, for centuries, right? Think about, the Silk Road or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's the sheer scale and speed of contemporary globalization that's unprecedented. And that's largely due to, advancements in technology.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of, what's fueling it, the textbook really emphasizes technology as a main driver, right? I mean, things like, back in the day, the telegraph, and more recently, the microchip. How have those things changed the game?
Well, those technologies absolutely revolutionize communication. I mean, think about it. They dramatically reduce the barriers of time and distance for exchanging information, capital, goods. It all just, speeds up.
Right.
But there's also this growing awareness of our interconnectedness that the book talks about. It's not just the technology itself. It's the recognition that, hey, events happening far away can actually have real consequences for us locally.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the political side of things, because a big debate in the book seems to center around, what happens to national governments in this globalized world?
Yeah, that's a really important point. The book digs into this tension between the idea that, globalization actually weakens state power, right? Because you have the rise of multinational corporations, the shift towards more of a minimalist state.
So less power for individual governments.
Yeah, potentially. But then there's this counter-argument that states actually remain super central to the whole process and can even use technology to strengthen their governance and how they gather information. So it's not this straightforward decline of the state that some people might imagine.
Okay, so it's complex. It's not black and white.
Exactly.
Now, economically, it seems like there's a lot of back and forth as well. Talk about winners and losers in this globalized economy. What's the book's take on that?
So the book dives into the role of these international institutions, right? Like the IMF and the WTO setting the rules of the game.
Right. But more importantly, I think, it looks at how economic globalization leads to increased trade and the flow of capital, which sounds great on paper. But then at the same time, the movement of people often faces more restrictions, like, visa policies and things like that.
Yeah, it's not equal for everyone.
Exactly. And it really highlights this fundamental debate between those who believe that, deregulation, opening everything up, that boosts economic growth, lifts everyone up, and those who are more concerned about, the potential for rising inequality and the erosion of, things like social safety nets, the welfare state.
So some are saying it's like everyone benefits, and others are saying, wait a minute, who's really benefiting from this?
Yeah, it's a huge debate.
And then culturally, there's this, this fear that everything's becoming the same.
Right.
It's like this global fast food chain, right? Like, is that a real concern that the book addresses? It definitely tackles this fear of what they call cultural homogenization, right? That everything's just becoming the same. But it also introduces this counter idea, which is cultural heterogenization. So that's the idea that, instead of one dominant culture taking over, you actually get this blending and mixing of cultures.
So like a hybrid sort of situation.
Yeah, think about, the example they give of, a khadi kurta being worn with jeans. It's like this really interesting mix of, external influences and local traditions.
Yeah, a fusion.
Exactly. And it also uses the example of like someone working in a call center and how they realize that, people from different cultures, they have all sorts of, different and sometimes conflicting perceptions of each other's culture. So it's not this simple one-way street.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, the book really focuses on India specifically and its journey with globalization. I mean, it's gone through some major changes, hasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, you think about India's history, right? Starting as, this key exporter of raw materials during the colonial period, then moving to a period of, protectionism after independence, trying to build up its own industries.
Right, shield themselves a little bit.
Exactly. And then you have these big economic reforms in 1991 that really opened India up to the global market.
Right, so a huge shift over time.
Huge shift. And the ongoing question, of course, is whether the benefits of this shift have reached, everyone equally.
Right, that's always the question.
Always the question.
Yeah. The last thing the book delves into is resistance to globalization.
Hmm.
And it seems like it's coming from, different sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, it's interesting. The book highlights this point that resistance to globalization, it comes from both the left and the right. I mean, on the left, you have concerns about global capitalism, inequality, exploitation. And on the right, you have worries about national sovereignty, cultural identity, the erosion of traditional values.
So even though they're coming at it from different angles, they both have problems with this idea.
Exactly. And the book mentions the World Social Forum, or WSF, as a key example of, organized opposition to what they call neoliberal globalization, which is this dominant sort of economic ideology driving the whole thing.
Okay, interesting. And what about in India specifically? What forms does resistance take?
Well, you see a lot of different forms of resistance,
Wow.
protests against multinational corporations, particularly in, agricultural areas.
Right.
Efforts to protect local resources like traditional knowledge about plants, pushback against patenting, things like that. So you have sort of these left-wing and right-wing concerns all playing out in different ways.
So from everything we've talked about, from these sources you've provided, I mean, it's clear that globalization is this incredibly dynamic force, this web of interconnectedness, really,
Yeah.
that creates, all sorts of opportunities.
Yeah.
But it also creates challenges, and it's experienced in such different ways across the globe.
That's a great summary. I mean, it's not a simple thing.
Not at all. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, and I think, thinking about all these connections and the ways that people are, responding to globalization, it really begs the question, and this is for everyone listening, what do you see as the most significant long-term impact of globalization on the world? What's going to stick with us? Something to really ponder. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.